American Chop Suey, the one-pot wonder that fed a generation. The smell hit you the second you walked through the door. Ground beef browning, onions going soft and sweet, and the sharp tang of tomato sauce. My grandmother never measured a thing. She'd dump in whatever was on sale, add elbow macaroni straight into the same pot, and somehow it always came out perfect. It started in school cafeterias, turning cheap beef and surplus tomatoes into something that stuck to your ribs. The kids actually ate it. Depression-era cooks knew how to stretch a pound of hamburger into dinner for 6. That knowledge lived on in houses like ours. Tuesday nights meant this pot would be on the stove by 5:30. The sound of that wooden spoon was like a dinner bell. When I finally made it myself, she came over and put her hands over mine on the spoon, showing me how to hear when it was ready. Because in the end, it wasn't just about the food, it was about home.
American Chop Suey, the one-pot wonder that fed a generation. The smell hit you the second you walked through the door. Ground beef browning in that old aluminum pot, onions going soft and sweet, the sharp tang of Hunt's tomato sauce just starting to bubble. My grandmother never measured anything. She'd dump in a can of whatever tomatoes were on sale that week, add elbow macaroni straight into the same pot, and somehow it always came out perfect. This was American Chop Suey, though half the country called it Goulash, and the other half got into arguments about which name was right. Nobody cared what it was called when they were scraping their plates clean on a Wednesday night in 1974. It started in school cafeterias right after the war, when lunch ladies were trying to feed hundreds of kids on almost nothing. They took cheap ground beef, the pasta that cost pennies per pound, canned tomatoes from government surplus, and turned it into something that stuck to your ribs. The kids actually ate it. That mattered more than anyone wants to admit now. My mother told me she had it every other week at Franklin Elementary, served on those divided trays with a little carton of milk and maybe some canned peaches if the budget allowed. She said the cafeteria version was bland, institutional, but filling. When she grew up and had her own kitchen, she remembered that dish and made it better. Tuesday nights in our house meant this pot would be on the stove by 5:30. My grandmother would start browning the meat while we were still doing homework at the kitchen table, and the sound of that wooden spoon hitting the bottom of the pot was like a dinner bell. She'd season it with whatever was in the cabinet. Sometimes Lowry's seasoned salt, sometimes just black pepper and garlic powder from a tin that had been there since before I was born. The meat would get all crumbly and dark at the edges, and she'd push it around until every bit had touched the hot metal. I'd watch her dump in a chopped onion, no tears, no fuss, and let it cook down until it disappeared into the beef. Depression-era cooks knew how to stretch a pound of hamburger into dinner for 6. That knowledge didn't die when times got better. It lived on in houses like ours, where working 2 jobs meant you needed something fast and cheap that everyone would actually eat. My grandmother grew up in a house where her mother made 1 pound of beef last 3 days. By the time she was cooking for us in the 70s, things were easier, but the habits stuck. She'd add a chopped green pepper if she had one, maybe some celery going soft in the crisper, half a can of mushrooms someone opened earlier in the week. Nothing went to waste. The vegetables would sweat down into the meat and disappear, adding flavor without adding cost. The first time I tried making this after I moved out, I called her 3 times. I couldn't remember if she added the macaroni before or after the tomatoes. I couldn't remember how much water. She laughed and said there were no rules. Just add enough liquid so the pasta could cook, and don't let it stick. I burned the bottom anyway, that acrid smell of scorched tomato that never quite leaves the pot. I cried over that pot, because it felt like I'd failed some basic test of adulthood. She came over the next week and made it with me, her hands over mine on the spoon, showing me how to hear when it needed more water by the way it bubbled. The name confused everyone. In New England, they called it American Chop Suey, a name that made no sense to anyone west of Connecticut. Italian grandmothers rolled their eyes and said it wasn't Italian. Chinese immigrants pointed out it had nothing to do with actual chop suey. Midwest families called it goulash, which made Hungarian cooks furious, because real goulash was something else entirely. The arguments at church potlucks could get heated. My grandmother said names didn't matter. Food was food, and if people liked it enough to argue about it, that meant it mattered to them. She was right about that, like she was right about most things. The cafeteria ladies who invented this knew what they were doing. They took the cheapest ingredients in post-war America and turned them into something kids would line up for. Ground beef was affordable after rationing ended. Elbow macaroni was shelf-stable and bought in bulk. Canned tomatoes lasted forever and gave the whole thing that red color kids associated with spaghetti, which they actually liked. Throw it all in one pot, add some American cheese if the budget had room, and you had a meal that cost maybe 30 cents per serving. Schools across the country served some version of this from 1946 through the early 80s. An entire generation grew up eating it, then went home and taught their own kids to make it. My mother kept a running grocery list on the side of the fridge, written on the back of old envelopes. Ground beef was always on there. A box of elbow macaroni, 2 big cans of whole tomatoes, the kind you had to break up with a spoon. She'd make this every week, sometimes twice if money was tight toward the end of the month. My father would come home from the factory, wash his hands at the kitchen sink, and sit down to a plate of this with white bread and margarine. He never complained. This was what dinner looked like for working people in the 70s. Simple, filling, made with what you had. The pot my grandmother used was old when she got it. A heavy aluminum thing with a wobbly handle that she wrapped in electrical tape so it wouldn't burn her hand. That pot made this dish at least twice a week for 30 years. The bottom was scratched and discolored, but she said that meant it was seasoned, that the food cooked better in a pot that had been used. I inherited that pot when she died, and I still use it. The tape is long gone, replaced 3 times over, but something about cooking this in her pot makes it taste right. The weight of it, the way the heat spreads, the specific sound the spoon makes against the bottom. Summer nights were harder because nobody wanted to eat hot food when it was 90 degrees and humid. But this dish was cheap enough that my grandmother would make it anyway, and we'd eat it with the windows open and the box fan running, sweating over our plates. The evolution from cafeteria slop to comfort food happened quietly in kitchens across America. Women who'd eaten this as kids remembered it fondly enough to make it for their own families. They'd improve it, add things their mothers never had access to. Fresh garlic instead of powder. Real tomatoes instead of canned, if it was August and they had a garden. Some people added kidney beans to stretch it further. Some stirred in frozen mixed vegetables toward the end. My aunt put corn in hers, which we thought was weird until we tried it and realized it added a little sweetness that balanced the acidity of the tomatoes. Everyone had their version, and everyone thought theirs was the right one. Regional variations were subtle but fierce. In Massachusetts, they served it with ketchup on the table and called anyone who didn't a snob. In Ohio, they mixed in shredded cheddar at the end until it got all gooey. Pennsylvania Dutch families added a bay leaf and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. Down south, some people stirred in a spoonful of peanut butter, which sounds insane until you taste it and realize it adds a depth you didn't know was missing. My grandmother's version was plain by comparison, but that plainness was the point. It tasted like itself, like our kitchen, like Tuesday night in 1976, with my homework spread across the table and her wooden spoon scraping the pot. The beauty of this dish was its flexibility. Payday was Friday, which meant by Thursday the fridge was empty except for the staples. Ground beef, onions, a box of macaroni, canned tomatoes. You could make this with exactly those 4 things and it would work. If you had more, you added more. If you didn't, you didn't. My grandmother never apologized for the simplicity. She'd spoon it onto our plates and say, this was what real people ate, not fancy restaurant food, not complicated recipes from magazines. This was dinner, honest and plain, and it had fed working families through the Depression, through the war, through every recession and hard time since. Weeknight dinners in the 70s had a rhythm. My father would get home around 6. My mother would have this ready by 6:15. We'd sit down together, all of us. No television, no getting up until your plate was clean. The pot would stay on the stove with the lid on, and my grandmother would get up twice during the meal to refill someone's plate. Seconds were expected. Thirds, if you wanted them. The pot was always empty by the end of the night, scraped clean and soaking in the sink. Nothing left over, nothing wasted. Every bit of that $3 meal eaten and appreciated. I make this now for my own kids, and they eat it without knowing its history. They don't know it started in cafeterias, don't know their great-grandmother made it twice a week, don't know the smell of it brings me back to homework at the kitchen table and the sound of that wooden spoon. To them, it's just dinner, just another thing Mom makes. Maybe that's how it should be. Food doesn't need a story to be good. But I tell them anyway, bits and pieces, how their great-grandmother never measured anything and it always came out right. How this fed a whole generation of kids on pennies per plate. How sometimes the simplest foods are the ones that stick with you. The pot sits on my stove now, same scratched bottom, same wobbly handle wrapped in new tape. I brown the ground beef the way she taught me, add the onions when it's almost done, let them soften into the meat. I dump in the tomatoes straight from the can, the macaroni without measuring, enough water to cook it through. It bubbles and thickens and fills my kitchen with the same smell that filled hers. My kids scrape their plates clean. That's all that matters. This dish doesn't need to be fancy. It never was. It just needs to taste like home.